Good morning. My name is J Zaucha. I'm working here at the University of Gdańsk. My job is teaching public economics. I'm a professor of public economics, but I had also privilege to join the team responsible for maritime spatial planning, MSP, here in Poland, the team which prepared the first maritime spatial plan. And this team was hosted by Maritime Institute in Gdańsk. So this lecture is based on both experiences. This related to MSP, and this one more theoretical on the role of public economics in the governance processes. I'm very happy that I can share my insight, which was prepared for the Seaplanspace project, Interreg South Baltic project, which is executed here at the University of Gdańsk, that I can share this insight on maritime spatial planning terminology with you. First, I would like to tell why I'm here in this role. So together with my colleagues from Maritime Institute in Gdańsk, we were responsible for preparation of the first maritime spatial plan in Poland. I am very happy because this plan was adopted in April 2021, a few days ago. And before doing this plan, we conducted study of condition of spatial development of Polish sea areas. And part of those studies was related to defining the most important terms for Polish MSP. So now I want to show you these terms and to show our insight into this topic. Issue which is important for all of us is the specificity of the sea space as a planning object. Then a few words about the history of maritime spatial planning, basic definition by WASAP, UNESCO, EU, and then a few words on the essence of maritime spatial planning, what are the key characteristics of this process, and at the end, I would like to invite you to read some textbooks or to look on important internet sources which can extend your knowledge on the MSP characteristics. What is the specificity of marine space? The first one, which you can find it in literature, you can find it in many papers, many textbooks, is that this marine space is multidimensional. So there is a sea surface, there is air above the sea surface, there is a water column, bottom, and subsoil. This is very important for maritime spatial planning because if something is happening on the bottom, for example, we are mining, we are extracting oil or gas, or we are extracting sand, this might not be harmful for the issues which are going on the surface. For example, extraction of sand makes no problem for navigation. Then another very important characteristics is a different ownership. This difference, because we know that on land, the plots, they belong to private owners. On sea, almost everything is owned by public entities. But there is something more. In addition to that, this difference I will show you at the next slide. There is also a different dynamics of diffusions of various processes, for example, ecological, biological processes. So there is no physical border at the sea. So what is happening on Polish space can affect easily, for example, erosion in the Kaliningrad region or in other parts of the Baltic Sea. Because of that, we have a very big importance of the cross-border cooperation, because we are planning entire sea, so those plans done by different countries should be more or less coherent. Also, we are planning an ecosystem, which means that we should pay attention to the important biological processes, but also to the important oceanographical processes. For example, erosion shaping the coastline. We must keep in mind that this is a functioning ecosystem, and what we are planning, what we are adding to the ecosystem can alter or can change all those processes. But in terms of planning, very important feature is a low number of stakeholders comparing to the land. Many of them, they are very well organized. And then, last but not least, it's a high level of uncertainty. So when we are planning the sea, usually the situation is that we don't have sufficient information available. So we must plan regardless, I mean, we should take as much information as possible, but regardless of this information gaps, there are some decisions necessary because life does not accept vacuum. So public authorities must take decisions on new sea users, on establishment of, for example, wind farms, and the lack of information should not be an excuse for that. Here on this slide, I want to show you this legal specificity of the sea. And the key issue is that the coastal states, they have limited jurisdiction over different parts of the sea. So there is a territorial sea and even internal waters, the waters between the coastline and the baseline. These territorial waters and internal waters, they are part of the territory of the country, and the country have almost full sovereignty in this area. Also, there are some exceptions which are not so important for maritime spatial planning. So in territorial waters, we have the principle of innocent passage. So there is a kind of freedom of shipping, but this issue is not so crucial for maritime spatial planning. Then there is an exclusive economic zone. Here there is a partial jurisdiction of the coastal state. And in this exclusive economic zone, maritime spatial planning plays important role because here we can allocate space, for example, for extraction of hydrocarbons. We can allocate space for production of renewable energy. All this is under the jurisdiction of the coastal state. Whereas we should pay attention to some freedoms. So for example, freedom of navigation, freedom of laying cables. We should ensure that those freedoms, that the other countries are not deprived of those freedoms in our exclusive economic zone. So as you can see, important role for maritime spatial planning is played by international law, especially by the conventions, law of the sea, UNCLOS. And maritime spatial planners, they must take into consideration both national law and those international conventions, because it's not only UNCLOS, there are some other conventions which are important for management, for spatial development of maritime spaces, especially exclusive economic zone. Why we have MSP? What was the origin? Well, the popular imagination is that we can accommodate whatever we wish on the sea, so we have such an association with emptiness. But in fact, this is not a reality any longer. So in the recent years, we witnessed a very fast appearance of new sea uses. So because of that, I mean, the drivers, the main sector which came to the sea was production of renewable energy, mainly wind farms in the Baltic Sea. Because of that, we started to witness more intensive spatial conflict. And somebody should regulate the spatial conflicts, how to ensure coexistence, for example, between shipping and those windmills or extraction of hydrocarbons. And those conflicts, which were usually dealt on land by maritime spatial planning, somehow prompted people to think that perhaps spatial planning is also important at sea. But also there were some other concerns, for example, deterioration of the marine environment. Because of that, people should critically think what their intervention mean for this coherent ecosystem, which I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. But also there was a very clear increase of importance of the concept of ecosystem services and the resilience of marine ecosystems if they should provide for us these ecosystem services in the future. And also there was a growing scale of land-sea spatial interactions, new cables, but also wind energy means a kind of landscape pollution, industrial landscape. But also there were new concepts like, for example, blue corridors. All of them should be put together, and maritime spatial planning offered such a framework of looking on those different issues in a harmonious way. So the starting point, the first maritime spatial planning was started in Australia. I will show you this plan. Then in Europe, first step was done by the ministerial conference, ministers responsible for spatial planning and development in the Baltic Sea region countries. The abbreviation of this cooperation of ministers is VASA, Vision and Strategies around the Baltic Sea. In 2001, they adopted Wismar Declaration. It's the first European document mentioning maritime spatial planning. Then there was a first plan. This plan was prepared in Germany, in the German land, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. They extended their terrestrial spatial plan to the territorial sea. And this was in conjunction of this Wismar Declaration, because Wismar is a small city in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. So the leaders of the Mecklenburg-Vorpommern spatial planning leaders, they were impressed and they were affected by this Wismar Declaration. And then significant role after that was played by EU Commission, UNESCO, also by WASAP, which started to cooperate with Helsinki Commission. There was a spatial WASAP HELCOM working group established in 2009 for promoting maritime spatial planning. And there was a number of international projects which were executed in different sea regions. Some of those projects were supported by EU Commission, DG Mare, some of them by Interreg, and they made a knowledge foundation for development of MSP. I will show you some of them. Here is this Australian plan. This was a Great Barrier Reef. The main concern was deterioration of the environmental state of this Great Barrier Reef. And you can see it was a kind of a zoning plan. So you had different zones with different colors. For example, this pink zone is so-called in maritime spatial planning non-go zone. So almost everything is forbidden there. So here you have what can be done in each zone, what activities require permit, and what activities are not possible. So this was a kind of zoning plan, and this was a great breakthrough because we realized that planning of the sea is possible and make sense. Few cornerstones, I mean, organization which pushed forward maritime spatial planning. One of the pioneers was the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO, which was established in 1960, but in 2006 there was a workshop organized by this commission, and during this workshop there was one of the first international discussions on the maritime spatial planning with different stakeholders, and this was then continued, and the most important contribution of UNESCO to the global MSP is the textbook A Step-by-Step Approach, which was published in 2009. This is the most important guide still used by all countries, by all planning authorities, how to make MSP in reality. And here I want to show you the person which was behind it, Charles Ehler. He's American, but he moved to Paris and he started to work for this commission in UNESCO, and he is MSP ambassador. And here is a part of the UNESCO website, and you can see after 14 years from this first meeting in Paris, so how many countries, the big number of different MSP initiatives all over the world. There are countries like China, which are promoting MSP, also in Africa. Here, MSP is very popular, also in some other countries, the United States as well. There are some maritime spatial plans. But as you can see, the core is here in Europe. Why in Europe and why in Baltic? Because of WASAP and EU Commission. So WASAP. Here you can see this Wismar Declaration 2001. During the ministerial conference, here is quotation from this document. Ministers, they realize the growing number of spatial conflicts in the coastal waters, therefore planning is necessary. But I think that one of the most important contributions of WASAP to MSP is the first sea basin vision of MSP, Vision 2030, which was done first as a part of both sea plans, this international project, and then adopted by WASAP. And this vision is telling what issues, what topics should be planned together by all countries. For example, shipping, navigation, but also fishery, blue corridors, conservation of the sea environment, of the maritime environment protection. This is a document which is somehow making frame for international cooperation of MSP, sea basin cooperation, but also is formulating key principles. So what does it mean, a sound, effective MSP? The role of EU Commission, so it was 2007, EU started to think about the integrated maritime policy. The main reason for this integration There were also conflicts, but also lack of synergies, lack of harmony between different policies affecting sea, affecting maritime marine ecosystems. So therefore, EU said that there is a need of kind of integration. They proposed to develop maritime policy in each country. And then they considered maritime spatial planning as one of the key cross-cutting tools for this integrated maritime policy. So this was very important because here there was a promotion of MSP at the EU level as an integrator of different policies. And you can see what could be integrated by MSP. This is a slide taken from the presentation of EU Commission. And space acts as an integrator because all those policies, all those sectors like fishery, like transport, but also research, energy production, protection of environment, the usage of space is providing a kind of common denominator for all of them. So therefore, this maritime spatial planning was so much promoted by EU Commission. And here you can see another person very important for the development of MSP in Europe. It's Heise Siemers. He was a head of one of the departments of DG Mare in EU Commission. And he managed to prepare, and then this document was adopted, a directive of EU and European Parliament. This directive on MSP, which was adopted in 2014. This directive establishes framework for maritime spatial planning in EU. There were very intensive discussion about this directive. Why? Because spatial planning, as a rule, is under competences of the member states. So EU has no competences in MSP. So this was slightly against EU rules. But according to what I told you about this integrated policy, so MSP was important. So intention of EU was to ensure that this MSP is functioning in all countries. So here on the slide, you can see that this directive is very general. So there are only few binding stipulations. So first of all, that there should be authorities responsible for spatial planning, that plans should be ready by the end of March 2021. So now we are in April. So hopefully this planning process is close to the end. At least Polish plan was adopted in April. And then that maritime spatial plan should be assessed at least every 10 years. So member states can do the revision process whenever they wish, but at least every 10 years there should be a kind of assessment whether those maritime spatial planning, they are doing the job which is required by them. So as you can see, very general directive, but it plays an important role because MSP should be installed in all EU countries. And then I told you a little bit about this international project. You can see Angela Schulz-Zieden from ESPRO, from Berlin. She was a person who prepared majority of those projects and then who coordinated them. And here you have a full picture because you have a picture of the different project, Balt Coast project. This project was the first, and this Mecklenburg-Vorpommern plan was somehow prepared under this project. Then there was a Baltic Sea Plan project, and this Baltic Sea Plan project resulted in this MSP vision. There were some indicative plans, pilot plans, for example, the Gulf of Bothnia. But what is important is that you can see here what has happened in parallel. So there was an interplay because those projects and EU work and then work of VASAP and other bodies. Here you have, for example, countries. So what you can see is that the results of the plan, they were translated into the policy, important policy document, for example, the VASAP guidelines of MSP or the principles on MSP. And then those guidelines, principles, they affected different plans. First, they were pilot plans, then real plans, they were adopted. And this make a coherent exchange of knowledge, information between countries, also between a level of professionals and level of decision makers. So this was very important, and this is thanks to Angela. And now about the definitions, because it's the core of our lecture. So here I would like to give you the most frequently used definition, of course, of UNESCO from this famous step-by-step approach, Maritime Spatial Planning Guide. So here, ILER and UNESCO and those people working together, they defined MSP as a process of analyzing and allocating parts of three-dimensional, some people they speak about more dimensions, marine space or marine ecosystem to specific uses. So here you can see the importance of human factors, because we are talking about the uses. Uses are somehow linked to the presence of what people are doing at the sea, in order to achieve ecological, economic, and social objectives that are usually specified through a political process. So you can see also here in this definition, this important feature of maritime spatial planning, looking for a kind of balance between different set of objectives, which is very important if we are planning an ecosystem, because we must take consideration of ecological factors, economic impacts, but also social objectives. So one of the key social objectives in MSP can be development of the coastal lagging behind areas. And what was also said by ILER is that this the political and social process, we should be informed by the best available knowledge, which is coming usually from natural and social sciences. So it's a need for combination of different types of knowledge. So MSP integrate different types of knowledge, and this is also a very important observation. Here on this slide, you have some other definitions. This is a definition from the directive that maritime spatial planning means a process by which the authorities of the member states analyze and organize human activities in marine areas to achieve ecological, economic, and social objectives. So there is not a big difference comparing to the UNESCO, because we have also this balance between objectives. We have also human factor here, but the difference is that we are putting emphasis on the role of member states. So this UNESCO definition is more open, because it's not telling MSP can be a joint effort of different social groups, for example, scientists, civil society groups, and authorities together, they can make MSP. Here, it's crystal clear that it's a task for the member states, for the authorities, public authorities. And here you have definition of VASAP. You remember this cooperation of ministers responsible for spatial planning and development in the Baltic Sea region. And here the difference is that they are taking a little bit this terrestrial experience into consideration. So they are telling that this is a kind of hierarchical process. We must look on different levels of planning. This is perhaps the biggest difference. And the second one difference is this focus on conflicts or competing uses. They are not explicitly mentioned in other definitions. And here we have this terrestrial legacy of MSP, that MSP is trying to find a way to find a kind of suitable solutions if we have a competitions between different users for the same space. But my favorite definition is the definition of Swedish spatial planner Thomas Anderson. He said that spatial planning is a process. This is a process which is preparing people to face uncertain future. And I think it's interesting because here, even in all those definitions, the process is important, but here this process is put at the forefront. I mean, we can see what is really important in MSP here is not an outcome, but this process of starting discussions, of making people aware what can happen for them if they don't take actions that are necessary in line with the existing scientific evidence and some tacit knowledge of different stakeholders. Continuing with the definition, I want to turn your attention that normally we're talking about MSP, and this is a very convenient way. Why? Because we have two different names in English. One is marine spatial planning and maritime spatial planning. I'm using both of them interchangeably, but some of my colleagues, some scholars, they think that might differ. Whereas if we are looking on the documents of EU Commission, we have always maritime spatial planning. Marine comes from Anglo-Saxon literature. So as I said, perhaps ILER was, he was somehow submerged in this terminology. So some of my colleagues, they say that marine spatial planning is more environmental or coherent ecosystem, whereas maritime spatial planning is more oriented towards this economic benefits of spatial development of the sea. So it's more blue growth oriented. And then a very important concept of maritime, of marine spatial development. So this is an outcome of human intervention in the sea, what is happening at the sea due to the decision of us, of people, can be partial outcome of MSP, but this spatial development can be done, of course, without MSP. It can be done in different ways. For example, in Denmark, there was a very well developed sectorial planning provided frame for maritime spatial development. And then the next very important definition, concept, term, it's blue growth. Blue growth is defined as smart, sustainable, and inclusive economic and employment growth from the ocean, seas, and the coast. So in simple words, it means that sea is providing us with GDP growth and providing us with new jobs, new employment opportunities. So this blue growth, as I showed you, it's more related to maritime spatial planning, whereas we were talking about marine spatial planning. Sometimes people, they say that blue growth, yes, but providing that it's not compromising the state of the marine environment. Here, it's a way how we can combine these two parts of this maritime spatial development. So here we have ocean economy according to the OECD. So the slide is taken from OECD documents. And we have ocean-based industries. So we have, for example, investment done by people, wind farms, some other artificial islands for extraction of, for example, hydrocarbons. So ocean-based industries, aquaculture. And here we have marine ecosystem, which are providing us with some services without our intervention. And here those services, they are named ecosystem services, and they play very important role. And we are forgetting, I mean, maritime spatial planner, if they are planning the sea, they should always keep in mind the importance of those ecosystem services, because we are forgetting them easily. So if you ask persons who are, using sea for recreation or even for fishing, so if you ask professional fishers about the services which are provided by the sea, usually they will refer to provisioning and cultural services, such services like food for consumption, like some resources can be also, beautiful shells or something like that. This is what sea is providing us without some effort, but it's producing this without a huge investment from human beings. And then culture, scenery, recreation, cultural heritage, all this we can take, and people, they can see it. But equally important are regulating services. Those services, for example, which are related to absorption of nutrients, diminishing eutrophication, climate change, positive influence of ocean, those negative climate change phenomena. This is, which is not so easily seen because we are not trading all those services. They don't have market value, but they play very important roles. They are important for our well-being. And then for all those three ecosystem services, important role is placed by supporting ecosystem services. For example, by primary production. So if you want to have beautiful dolphins, we want to observe, dolphins, they must have first a fish, and this fish must have a kind of feed of zoobentos or something like that. So here, when we are planning, we should secure a sound food web dynamics. If we spoil this food web by our planning decisions, that we have no provisioning and no cultural services. And this is very important to pay attention to all those services together, the linkages between them. So now I want to move to the essence of MSP to show you key assumption about MSP. So we can say out of those definitions that MSP is a form of marine governance, but this is a problem which is fundamentally challenging. It's named in the literature weak problem. Why? Because we have a lot of levels, sectors, actors, policies which must be taken into consideration, and this makes a problem. We have insufficient knowledge base. This is very important to say it here. We have a problem with agreement on some objectives. So there is a disagreement. It was said in all those definitions that MSP should allocate space in line with the key objectives. That the problem is how to do it if the objectives are not agreed. And if there is a problem between agreed even objectives between the countries which are developing the same sea basin. And we can see it. Polish plan, German plan is more oriented toward blue growth than, for example, Swedish plan. And then what is very important assumption, what we must remember is that context matters. So planning culture, planning experience differs between the countries. And this means that we will have different planning processes. In some countries, the planning process will be more stakeholder oriented. In some other, they will be more expert driven. And this is the case, and it means the MSP outcomes will be also very, very different. So this is, about key assumption, and we must accept those differences. We must accept those ambiguity and disagreements. We must accept this insufficient knowledge base, and we must cope with this complexity of levels and actors and policies. So what we can say for sure about MSP, so there is no doubt that maritime spatial planning is regulating the use of the sea space, sea areas, and it must be done in multidimensional way. This is not easy because plan, which I showed to you, this Polish plan is flat. And now how to show on this flat plan different dimensions? We did it by delimiting sub-sea areas. So something is on the bottom only, but it was really challenging. Then the MSP is covering both space and time. So when we're deciding about the usage, it's not only where it should take place, but also when, because some areas can be used, for example, by birds for their rest during the winter time, and then they can be used by recreation, by people sailing on their own yachts during the summertime. So MSP is about aggregation of individual preferences towards the maritime space into the social preferences. This is a key feature, or it's an essence of the public choice process, is aggregation of preferences. And this is one of the key tasks for maritime spatial planning, to see what are the preferences of different stakeholders towards the sea. And this is not easy, because even if we have some national documents which are telling us what are the preferences, still in the maritime spatial planning, we should look for other stakeholders which were not so active during the preparation of those national documents. And this is not an easy task. We try to do it in a Polish maritime spatial plan, but still now when we are checking the result, when we are checking the perception of our plan by people, we found out that some stakeholders, they were not properly informed, they were unable to take part in the planning process. And then what is also a very important feature, that in MSP we have interplay between market and public choice. So I told you that MSP is mainly public choice process. So we are deciding, public authorities are deciding, but those public authorities, they cannot neglect market. These are very important market interests. For example, there is a huge rent we can take from wind energy. So believe me, those developers who are developing wind energy, definitely they will find a way how to influence the plan that their stake is taken into consideration. Now, key assumptions continuing. So how MSP should look like? So it should be integrated. It should use best available information, should be done in a cross-border and transnational way. So it should be coherent within the sea basin which is planned, and should be coordinated with land-based spatial planning to avoid new planning borders at the coast. We should have a kind of coherence. In some countries it's easy, like in Germany, because the Mecklenburg-Vorpommern plan, which I described to you, this plan is covering both land and sea. But in Poland, sea is planned by national authorities, land is planned by local municipalities, so this coherence must be ensured some way. And then what is also very important assumption, that MSP should be a continuous process. So it means that we should not stop, we should not be satisfied when we prepare, when plan is ready, plan is adopted by the government. We should start new planning cycle. we should start evaluation of the plan, but also we should collect information, evidences from stakeholders in order to be prepared for adjustment of the plan or preparation of a new plan. And here is this most important tool or vehicle for planning. This is an MSP cycle. This is a cycle which is taken from UNESCO guide. So you can see that here you have different phases. And as I told you, this guide is used by many countries. But here, what is important that this guide is providing a very concrete suggestions, also in terms of staging MSP. So here we should have pre-planning phase. So we should decide in this pre-planning phase is very important because we should decide who should make MSP, how it should be financed, but also we should properly prepare stakeholders. This is the biggest mistake done in MSP, to start work with stakeholders only during the planning. It's too late. So here we should tell stakeholders, we should inform them, educate about the MSP, to have a real feedback from them during the planning process. Now, organizing process, this is a pre-planning. So it was pre-planning, here is pre-planning. So we should have a team, it should be interdisciplinary team. We should have also those principles, goals, because according to the definitions, they play a very important role. And we should also know what area we are planning. So it's a little bit easier. And then we should start planning from mapping what is happening. So mapping biological, ecological processes, oceanographic processes. We should map what are the existing users and what are the conflicts between them, even possible conflicts, because we should look also for the future demands. So what will be the new users? And then we should identify some alternatives of developing of maritime spatial plans. We should find the most suitable alternative. Here, in all those stages, we should work together with stakeholders, and then on those basis of decision, we can prepare planning stipulation, planning regulation, which can be accepted by the body which is responsible for MSP. In each country is a little bit different. And then when the plan is approved, we start implementation, and this means monitoring. So implementation means that, for example, all those licenses, permits will be given in line with the plan, but we should monitor what is happening. We should evaluate the plan, and then, as I told you, we should collect evidences for preparation of new plan or adjustment of the existing plan. So this is a cycle. So this is a situation that when we are starting implementation, in the same time, we are entering new planning cycle. Here, I want to show you on this slide the most important differences in thinking about the MSP. I think that what are the differences between plans? And this is due to this situation that the MSP is in hands of the national authorities. So each plan can be a little bit different, done in a different way. So the differences is, for example, in the degree of detail. Here in Poland, we have plans which are very general, but we have also very local plans, for example, for bays, for lagoons. Then legal force of maritime spatial plan, we have binding plans like in Poland and Germany, but we have also guiding plans like in Norway and Finland. And here they also fulfill their role, because even if they have a guiding character, the entities, the actors, they voluntarily, they somehow try to follow those stipulations of the plan. Also, the plans, they have different scope. They are regulating different sectors. This is not the rule that MSP is covering all sectors, and these regulations can differ in terms of detail, but also in the plans, they differ in terms of information about the maritime space which are provided in those plans. And also very big differences are in the way of involving stakeholders, expert-driven planning, stakeholder-driven planning. There are some pros and cons, because if you have stakeholder-driven planning, it takes a lot of time. And fascinating is that at the end, only when the plan is ready, the stakeholders sometimes they understand the importance, and they want to discuss from the very beginning also assumptions. So stakeholder-driven planning is really time and resource intensive. And then here it's also a big discussion between planning and management, because we have a concept of integrated coastal zone management. And what is the relation between planning and integrated coastal zone management? So some people, they say that maritime spatial planning is part of management, is one of the steps of management. This is in line with many textbooks on management. But in some countries, there is a feeling that the MSP is the main management tool, and the other processes, they should follow MSP, because MSP is so cross-cutting, it's so comprehensive. So because of that, it plays very important management role. In Poland, I would say this integrated coastal zone management is not so prominent. So MSP indeed is playing very important role with regard to sea areas, whereas in some other countries, it's vice versa. For example, in Croatia is situations that this MSP should be a kind of addition to this integrated coastal zone management way of thinking. Now about some myths about MSP. I want to share with you now my experience with discussions with other planners and also discussion with stakeholders. So the first, I think, very important statement from my side is that MSP will not substitute all other sector policies in the management of the sea. So as I told you, in Poland, it's very important, but also other policies are necessary. Why? For example, in MSP, we want to develop wind farms. And those wind farms, we can allocate space for them. We can also only allocate space, and we cannot force developers to build such a wind farm. Of course, it depends on the oceanographic conditions, but also on some other policies. For example, policy which is subsidizing the price of energy, of policy which is facilitating connection of the wind farm to the national transmission grid. So all this should work together with MSP. If those policies are missing, we will have no result. MSP should not be treated as exclusive domain of environmental protection. In some countries they are doing it. Why? Because we have this experience of the Great Barrier Reef Plan in Australia, which I mentioned. But in Europe, we have a Marine Strategy Framework Directive, very important to ensure the good status of the marine ecosystems. But MSP, according to all those definitions, should also take into consideration those social and economic concerns. Other way around, MSP will be flat, will be not comprehensive enough, and will not play its role. MSP will not solve all conflicts. That was the expectation when we started MSP process, that all stakeholders, they say, okay, we have such a conflict, try to solve it. For example, Navy is closing some of our fishing areas because they want to do training there. No, MSP will not do it. MSP cannot also do a lot of with very important conflict like eutrophication of the Baltic Sea. We can allocate some space, for example, for the environmental friendly aquaculture, but maximum what can be done under MSP. We must also keep in mind that social preferences change over time, so plan must be flexible. We witnessed it in the Polish case. We started in 2016, we finished in 2019, so this was a 4 years process. So during these 4 years, there was a changes of preferences. For example, in terms of wind energy, here we were very happy that our plan was flexible enough to accommodate this additional demand. MSP is not only zoning. So I showed you this Australian plan. You can see what does it mean zoning. So you have different zones and different regulation in the zones, but this is not enough. In MSP, you should have also some general principles, general rules for location of the sea uses. I know plans, they have no zoning at all. They have only principles and rules. And some principles they can indicate, for example, what type of technology should be used for building wind farms. So it should be best, more environmental friendly technology, which is minimizing the negative environmental impact. What I told you, but I want to come back to this because it's very important statement, that the planning process is as important as the final effect. So plan is important. Planning process is a key precondition for having a right plan, the plan which will work. We can have an excellent plan done by the best experts, but the stakeholders will not pay attention to it because there is no stakeholder ownership. So planning process must ensure this ownership of different bodies which are responsible for the management, for the spatial development of the maritime space. And we must also keep in mind that planning is a social process. And this means that it's prone to different risks, for example, of irrational or inconsistent decisions. So the biggest problem is that the planning can be captured by the vested interest. And then this is not taking into consideration the social benefits of the weak stakeholder. But in such a planning, mainly those who are well organized, they can achieve. So even if I told you that the spatial planning is a public choice process, so it's an administrative decision. So please keep in mind this administration can be influenced by the business sectors, and this can create a huge risk for the consistency for the outcome. At the end, I want to encourage you to read some books about MSP. So here you can see the recent book about maritime spatial planning, which is covering all MSP aspects. Here you have an example of the book which is relating national regional policies to MSP. Here is a pilot plan. And here you can see it's a very interesting comic. It's a very small book, which is, informing about MSP in a nutshell, in a very easy way. So, there was a slogan, so that became maritime spatial planner in 10 minutes, which is not possible. And of course, please read this vision, because this vision played a very important role, at least here in the Baltic Sea, in development of real maritime spatial plans. And of course, the key textbooks. One is Marine Spatial Planning Step by Step by UNESCO. This is really great guide. And the second is a Baltic guide, which was prepared under one of those project Plan Coast. I would say it's a little bit more practical and rooted into the concrete MSP experience, because this was prepared by planners themselves. Here, maritime spatial planning is very comprehensive, very great, done by Ilar. He's raising a lot of important concerns, but it's very nice to check, to compare those both approaches. Here, I would like to recommend you to look on the MSP platform. Thank you very much for your attention.